Hello everyone and welcome to today's BASE webinar with Doug from AQR International. We're absolutely delighted to have him here with us. The format of today will be a presentation from Doug on the topic today of mental toughness, and Doug has prepared a few slides which we'll be showing and he'll be talking through. You are muted, everybody, but you do have the ability to communicate with us through the chat function, which you'll see on the right-hand side. And Doug's very kindly offered to answer any questions that you may have as you go through. So please feel free to stick some questions in that chat box as we go, and we'll pose them to him at the end. So without further ado, Doug, I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you, Joanna. Great. Well, welcome to everyone. Today we're going to spend a bit of time looking at the concept of mental toughness, and it is a crucially important concept. Although the slide says it's a concept for these times, and that's absolutely true. It is, if anything, is really important at this time when we've got this very volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. I mean, it's so difficult to kind of foresee what's going to happen in the next week, never mind next year. It's mental toughness. Our mental toughness really matters. Now, although the concept and the term appears to be very new and very modern, in fact, it's a very old idea. The first mention of this concept, using a slightly different language, was by Plato. Plato spoke about the idea of fortitude being important. And if you do go and look at what Plato described as fortitude, you'll find it's exactly the same as what I'm going to be describing to you today. And then we wrote, that's 2,500 years ago. So the concept's been around a long time. We've always known it's important, but until very recently, we've naturally not known exactly what it is. And that has prevented us from optimizing it. But today I'm going to tell you we've actually got there. We understand what mental toughness is, and we can now begin to operationalize it. We're able to use it. And in fact, if you roll on around the time of Christ, you find that in Rome there was a Stoic movement. And so when we hear about Stoicism and the Stoics, again, that's a slightly different expression of the same concept. It's been around for a long, long time. So what we're going to cover today, well, we're going to look at what is mental toughness and why it's so important for our mental health and well-being, especially in that very challenging world that we live in right now. But let's face it, the world we live in, I'd say from the turn of the century, has been pretty volatile and uncertain pretty much all the time. I mean, now we're perhaps into a super VUCA phase, but it's always been volatile. And then can we assess it? Can we understand it? Can we somehow use it to improve something about ourselves? And what we will learn is that actually it is the key to self-awareness, and self-awareness then creates the opportunity for reflection, and that is fundamentally important in being able to be the best version of ourselves that we can be. So the emphasis throughout this webinar is not how can I be more mentally tough. It's about how can I be the best version of me that I can be. And then finally, we'll happily deal with any questions that you may have. So we start, what is the definition? I've worked for almost 30 years with Professor Peter Clough, and together we've written some books on the subject, but we've also created what is now accepted as the most widely understood definition of it, and that is it's a personality trait. That is important to understand. That it sits in every single one of us. It's not something that we can decide to have or not have. It's a personality trait which determines in some part, so it's a big part of the solution, it's not the whole of the solution. It determines how individuals respond mentally when exposed to stress, pressure, opportunity and challenge, irrespective of the prevailing situation. So it's very much about our mental responses to events. Now, I'm sure that almost everybody listening, whenever we do a webinar, everybody has completed some personality measures or personality tests at some time in their life or their career. But I can tell you almost certainly what you will have completed is a behavioral measure. So it's a questionnaire that helps to predict how you behave or how you act when things happen. That's a very useful thing to know, but it's not the most important thing to know. The most important thing to know is, why do I act the way I do? And that's what the mental toughness concept brings. What it's doing is helping us to understand how we think when things happen to us. And if we can understand how we think, well, we already know that it determines our behaviors and our emotions. But if we can understand how we think, then it helps us to be able to direct interventions or make decisions about what is it that I want to change or improve about myself. So, is it important? Well, the other thing that should reassure you is that I'm not talking about a fad. I'm not talking about something that somebody's conjured up on a kitchen table. This is real, solid science. The work that underpins the mental toughness concept is now supported by over 250 peer-reviewed academic papers. And importantly, from your perspective, every single one of those papers is independent of AQR. That's our organization. We provide the tests to academics all over the world, and we let them play with it and explore it. And what they show is that there are big connections between mental toughness and certainly 4 major areas. Firstly, well-being. There's a massive research that shows that the mentally tough and the mentally sensitive, and we'll talk about that in a moment, respond differently to events. They will experience anxiety, depression, and even things like suicidal thoughts in different ways, and they'll deal with them in different ways. There's also a big correlation between mental toughness and performance. So the research consistently shows that your mental toughness accounts for 25% of the variation in your performance. So that is very significant. Be careful, that's not about 25% of your performance. Your level of mental toughness impacts on 25% of the difference in your performance. And that's still important. And then there's mental toughness links to agility. That's really talking about today's world. Such a lot happens so quickly and change occurs so quickly. Can I respond effectively to that? And then finally, as we go through our life, we want to achieve something. And there's evidence to show that the mentally tough tend to have higher aspirations than mentally sensitive people, and the mentally tough tend to achieve their aspiration a lot more. So is it important? Well, I can leave you to think about that, but I would say it's crucially important. So if we link it to stress, the interesting thing about stress is stress in itself is neither a good or a bad thing. We actually we swim in a sea of stress. Things go wrong all the time, and very often we apply stressors to ourselves. We want to achieve something that means making an extra effort, getting up earlier in the morning, maybe going out and doing something regularly for many, many days that we really didn't plan to do. What matters is not that these stressors exist, it's how do we respond to those stressors? Because you can have exactly the same set of stressors. You can put 2 people in the same situation, and one will succumb to the stress and the other one will thrive. So what we are able to do with the mental toughness concept is explain that difference and usefully help people who are succumbing to perhaps survive better and even thrive. Now, stress itself has got 2 dimensions. There's a physiological dimension, and that's talking about perspiration, about our erratic breathing, about muscular tension, all of these things that impact on our well-being. But there's also the psychological dimension, and that's what we're really tackling here today. We're talking about how we're responding mentally to the things that happen to us. So let's look at mental toughness beyond that definition. What Professor Clough developed and found was, and this was the big breakthrough, that mental toughness consisted of 4 elements. Psychologists call these constructs. And these were control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. And you can see those on the pizza image. And what he found is that they were independent, but they were still part of a common concept. And that concept was mental toughness. But each of those elements, those constructs, had 2 factors. Now, the significance of that is what we now know is that there are 8 elements that contribute to the way I respond mentally when something happens. And for each and every one of us, that pattern of the 8 factors will be quite unique. And in fact, the number of potential combinations of those 8 factors is about 40,000. So the other thing that we're doing here is we're not sort of saying you're introvert or extrovert. We're not putting you into 2 big boxes. We're able, with the mental toughness concept, to be able to dig down much more deeply than that, and to be able to treat you as an individual and identify you as an individual. And that's important, because although there are similarities between all of us, we are all quite unique. We're all quite individual. And for each of us, the solution for a particular problem will be unique to us. So I'm just going to go very quickly through the 8 factors so that you can understand those a little bit better. And whilst I'm doing that, think of them as aspects of mindset. This is how I would be thinking. And you can think about how that might apply to you, or how you're responding to what's happening to you at the present time. So the first element is control. And control we can describe as the ability to, or the belief that I control enough of my life and my circumstances to be able to achieve what I want. That's not necessarily control everything, but control enough of my life. And the first element is something called life control. And this is, to sum it up, this is where the sense of can-do sits. And the easiest way of illustrating that is you have a very, very challenging job to do. You go to 2 people, you give it to one and say, look, I've got to do this. It's got to be done by tonight. You're really going to have to pull everything out to do it. And the person responds by saying, just leave it with me. That person has a strong sense of can-do. That person has got a strong sense of life control. It believes, or she believes, that they can do what they're being asked to do. Person B might respond completely differently. They might start saying, well, I don't know whether I can do that. If I do this, or if I give up this, I might be able to do it. I could, might. As soon as they start using conditional language or negative language, you know that in their head, they're already thinking about reasons why they can't do it. And so what this is describing and assessing is what goes through your head when you have to do something, and something that is maybe challenging or responding to a stressor or some sort of pressure. So that's life control. But what we also know is that there's another element in the control construct, and that's emotional control. Because you can have a strong sense of can-do, but if you aren't able to manage your emotions, and that's what this is about, it's perfectly possible to say, yeah, give it to me, I'll get it done by tonight. First hiccup arrives, you blow a fuse, throw everything out the window, and suddenly you're not able to achieve what you said you were going to achieve. So to be able to manage your emotions is an important aspect of control. So it's not just that you can control elements of your surroundings and your circumstances, but you've got to control yourself as well. And so what we know here is we're able to understand and describe how somebody is mentally responding to the emotional pressures they're under. So somebody with a high degree of emotional control will be able to maintain poise and calm, even when things are going wrong, even if things inside their head are kind of falling apart. They're able to manage their responses. Whereas people who have got low level of emotional control are going to be at the other end of the scale. You're going to see their their anxiety. You're going to see their irritation. You're going to see their anger. The next construct is commitment. And this has got two elements. Commitment is basically, it's quite a well understood concept. It's about stickability. But what we know is it rests on two factors that run through your head. The first one is goal orientation. And this is about liking working to goals. This is about having a preference for visualizing success, visualizing what you need to do. And the reason you do that is because if you can visualize what the end product looks like, for a lot of people, it's motivational. For a lot of people, it gives them fuel and energy to be able to achieve what they want to do. But not everybody, and we're talking perhaps 30 or 40% of the population, thinks in terms of goals. They will not have that kind of focus to their lives, either because they find goals frightening or they simply don't think in terms of goals. However, the goal orientation, if we talk about setting goals, we all know people who say they'll do this and then never do it. And so the other component of commitment is what we call achievement orientation. And this is basically, I'm going to do what it takes. Your mental approach to making the effort to do what you say you're going to do, either for yourself or for others. And again, we can see this. Some people will be very goal orientated. They'll have amazing amount of talent, but they won't pull the finger out to get a job done. And so again, people who've got very high levels of achievement orientation are people who can be quite self-sacrificing. They will focus, they won't allow themselves to be distracted, and they will do what they have to do in order to deliver what's been promised. People at the other end who've got low levels of achievement orientation will find making that effort somehow a real effort, and it will put them off making the effort. So that's control and commitment. Before I move on to challenge, people will often talk about what's the difference between mental toughness and resilience. Well, what I've just described as resilience. Resilience is a concept that's got a very well long established definition. It's the ability to respond to an adverse situation. And if you've got a high level of control and a high level of commitment, if things go wrong, you can generally pick yourself up, dust yourself off and carry on going. But there's no implication there that you actually want to do that. And the potential downside, I mean, resilience is a very positive quality. It's a very important quality. But if you aren't positive about your resilience, if you don't want to be resilient, it can wear you out. So resilience on its own is very useful for survival. It's not necessarily useful for long-term thriving. We know this because a very clever American called Suzanne Cavassa understood that there was another element, and she called that challenge. And what we've been able to do is to understand what this is. And challenge is essentially where we're beginning to bring a positive element into the mental toughness concept. She understood that some of us were better at identifying opportunities than the threats, whereas others will always see the threat long before they ever see the opportunity. And so what we've understood is that challenge consists of two elements. One is risk orientation, and that's the ability to see opportunity. It's the ability to respond to new situations, to actually look forward to new things. So if you think, I'm going to learn how to fly a new aircraft, or I'm going to go and work for a new organization, some people will face that with trepidation. Some people will face that with sheer excitement. They will look forward to doing something they've never done before. So this element of risk orientation is very, very important. But the interesting thing about risk orientation is, yes, people will often push themselves. They will try new things. They'll go to new places. They'll work with new people. But if that doesn't work for them, you can get one of two responses. Sometimes people will say, well, I tried that, never doing it again. Others, however, will say, I tried that, it didn't work, but hang on a minute, I think I've learned something. And now that I've learned something, I can either do it better next time, or I'm going to give it another go. And so the second component of challenge is learning orientation. And for me, this is the beating heart of the whole mental toughness concept. This is about understanding that everything that happens to you and around you is an opportunity for learning. If you don't take those opportunities, you'll drift through life and you'll just keep on repeating your mistakes. But if you've got a mindset that is reflective and you learn from everything, even things like redundancy, so what's happened to me? Well, what's the worst that can happen to me? Do opportunities open up? These are people who see setbacks as opportunities for learning. So that's challenge. It consists of risk orientation and learning orientation. But when I mentioned my colleague, Professor Clough, bit by bit, psychologists have begun to understand that those three elements, control, commitment, and challenge, existed, but it still didn't answer everything or every problem that arose. What Peter Clough was able to do is add confidence to the picture, and that seems to have completed the picture. Now, confidence is where self-belief sits. Confidence is very, very important. And we know it consists of two elements. One is having confidence in abilities. This is an interesting one because it's got an interesting relationship with abilities. What we're talking about here is you could be one of the cleverest people on the planet, but if you don't believe in yourself, you won't use those abilities. And I've just come across a very, very good example of that. I've been working with a major university, working with some incredibly clever people who are now faced with the prospect that the careers might not go the way they wanted to go. And despite the fact that they are incredibly clever, they feel crushed by the process because they don't believe in their own abilities. And yet they've got amazing abilities. Their ability to critically analyze and work out solutions far exceeds mine. But they don't think they can do it, so they don't do it. So this is about having self-belief. The second element, though, was interpersonal confidence, because even if you have ability and you've got a high degree of confidence in your abilities, if you're not prepared to show it, to demonstrate it, to share it with other people, nobody will ever know you've got it. And this is about having a self-belief to influence others as much as they do you. And probably the most important manifestation for all of us of interpersonal confidence is the first of these bullet points that I put up there, being prepared to ask questions. By that, I mean, I have time and time again worked with students who will attend a class or a lecture, and they'll come out of the class or the lecture and you say, well, did you enjoy that? And they say, well, I didn't understand it. And so you say, well, why didn't you ask a question? Why didn't you ask them to repeat what they've been covering? And similarly, you go into work and you see managers going into meetings and then coming out confused and not knowing not fully understanding what's being discussed. And you say, well, why didn't you ask a question? And the answer is generally, well, I didn't want to look stupid. Somebody with a high level of interpersonal confidence isn't worried about looking stupid. They want to know the answer to, or the missing element that they fail to grasp. So this is quite an important aspect of mental toughness. So that's a quick run through the mental toughness concept. So the 4 constructs, but more importantly, the 8 factors. Because if we can analyze and understand ourselves at that level, then we stand a chance of being able to do something about it. It's very hard to target a very big, broad issue. It's much easier to be able to say, all right, now I understand. I perhaps am not as interpersonally confident as I should be. The rest, I'm okay. That's what's holding me back. So we just take an overview. The image is capturing some of the stuff that I've described. So the top half is describing resilience. The bottom half is describing positivity, seeing and seizing opportunity. And together, they come together in this concept of mental toughness. that Plato long ago called fortitude. But you can also see that the factors on the left are really talking about the things that sit inside you, that give you kind of oomph, and the factors on the outside, on the right-hand side, are talking about the sort of things that are important if you have to engage with the world around you. So mental toughness describes how we think when things happen, and it's valuable because it's helping us to understand the answer to that question: why do we act the way we do? So we know what it is, but there are a couple of important points. I've spoken for the last 20 minutes about mental toughness, and it is easy to think, oh wow, mental toughness is fantastic, I want to be mentally tough, or everybody should be mentally tough. In fact, mental toughness is a spectrum. At one end, you've got mental toughness. That's the sort of person who will breeze through life, taking all the adverse things in their stride and seemingly succeeding at most things without making a huge amount of effort. The other end of the spectrum, you've got mental sensitivity. And these are people who tend to have low scores on the scales I've just described, and who feel every bump on the road through life. And for them, it's often stop, start, and sometimes it's stop for a long time. So they will tend to experience high levels of anxiety, depression, and so on, and they may well perform less well. But the fact is, we sit on that spectrum. Very few of us are truly mentally tough, and very few of us are truly mentally sensitive. We're actually, in terms of the factors, a mixture of these. And the other interesting thing is, being mentally tough isn't necessarily all win-win-win. It is possible to be mentally tough and to underperform. It's also, being mentally sensitive isn't all about having problems. Mentally sensitive people also have some interesting strengths and positives. And the interesting thing is that what's important here is that it's self-awareness about mental toughness that matters. Mentally tough and mentally sensitive people can achieve, but they can only do so if they are aware of where their mental toughness or the mental sensitivity comes from and what the implications of that are. So in a sense, our mantra for all of our development work is self-awareness matters. Understand yourself, then reflect on what that means for you, work out what you might or might not want to do, and then do something positive about changing it or developing it. Can we assess mental toughness? Well, the interesting thing is that an important byproduct of the work that Peter Clough, Professor Peter Clough, and ourselves have carried out is we've been able to develop a quite unique, very high quality measure called the MTQ Plus that is capable of assessing mental toughness, assessing the 4 constructs and the 8 factors. It's valid and reliable. That's technical terminology to tell you that it really works, and it works most of the time. It's accessible, it's online, and the reports are generated immediately. So it's perfectly possible to do that. And as part of this webinar, there is an opportunity for you, if you wish, to be able to access this at a subsidized rate. This is an example of what a profile looks like. And this is a particularly interesting example, because what we can see at the top of the output from the results of the questionnaire is that this individual has a mental toughness score of 7. We won't go into the way that the scales work, but they obviously run 1 to 10. So 7 is at the higher end of the scale. This person we know is a high achiever, and he's got a fairly high mental toughness score. So you'd expect this person to be a high achiever. But then when you look at the factors that I've just described, and these are the scores indicated in yellow, we can see that this person got a very high score in life control, obviously a very high level of can-do, very high level of goal orientation and achievement orientation and risk orientation. So this is this kind of person who would make a great project leader. I've got a new project, I need somebody to take charge of it who's got the right mindset and mentality to do it. This is describing that person. But look, this person also has a very low level of emotional control. That's really interesting, because this is telling us that perhaps this person doesn't deal terribly well with setbacks. And if something goes wrong or something holds them up, they can go into a sulk for a long time. They can even get annoyed. They can maybe take it out on others. They will not manage their emotions. And this person also has a comparatively low level of learning orientation. In other words, when things go wrong, this person doesn't necessarily work out what's gone on. They're not particularly a reflective person. So even though this person is a high achiever and has got overall a pretty reasonable profile, this person still has a couple of areas of development need. And in this particular case, this person initially didn't accept that, but after a time began to understand, yeah, this is a pretty accurate picture of me. And has now, well, over the past couple of years, this person has made big strides in changing their emotional control and their learning orientation scores, and changed their life, their well-being and their performance in some important ways. Now, can we develop mental toughness and improve our responses to stressors? The answer is definitely yes, if we want to. And that's really important. We know from all the research, the stuff that I referred to earlier, that part of our mental toughness is genetic. And there's not that much you can do about it unless you start tinkering with your DNA. But a big part of it, around 50% for most people, has been developed through your life's experiences. So whatever happens to you when you were a young person, whatever happens to you in school, what happens to you when you start a job, all those experiences have taught you how to respond to events. And that simply means that that's experiential learning. We can use experiential learning to change that if we want to. But we don't necessarily all want to change. So for instance, if it's really important for you to be able to deal more effectively with life and all its challenges and very specific challenges, then it might well be useful to you to be able to develop your mental toughness, to change your mental toughness, to become more mentally tough. And of course, if you've got the assessment, you can also identify exactly where you want to change. But actually, a lot of people are pretty content with who they are, and they don't necessarily want to change, but what they want to do is to learn how to cope with the consequences of who they are. And so their approach will be to say, well, okay, I want to develop behaviors, attitudes, habits that help me to deal with the downsides of some aspects of my personality, but I don't actually want to change. And both approaches are valid, but they both rely upon the same thing. The first thing is self-awareness. If you know you're stressed, or you know you're not facing up to challenges very well, the first thing you need to understand is why. And that's fundamentally important. The second step is, okay, now I understand why, what are the consequences? What are the implications for me? The next step is to say, well, what do I want to do about it? Do I want to learn how to cope with it, or do I actually want to change myself? And then doing something about it. And then finally, somehow measuring what's happening. And that's where the mental toughness questionnaire comes in, because we're able to measure before and after, and you're able to then to be able to relate it to some improvement in your well-being or improvement in your performance. Now, mental toughness development. The development path will vary a little according to your mental sensitivity or your mental toughness. Because if you're mentally sensitive, the issues are more generally about your performance and behavior. In other words, what's stopping me from doing this? And why am I reacting to this situation in this way? And sometimes it's about how other people perceive you. Do they understand why I'm always quiet in a meeting? For the mentally tough, the issues are generally much more about the way other people see me or are responding to me. So again, to illustrate that, if I've got a very high level of control, my attitude can be, I can do it, but my attitude can also spill over if I can do it, why can't you? And so the impact on other people can be quite dramatic. Similarly with commitment, I'm prepared to work hard, why aren't you? And you can push other people beyond their capability to be able to deal with workload pressures. With challenge, look, I'm going to go and try something new. I think we need to enter a new market. I think we need to do this. I think we need to do that. You can either do too much of that and put people into a tiz, or you can sometimes push the risk element too far, and that makes people uncomfortable as well. And with confidence, being too confident, it's really interesting because people will often very much respect very confident people, but in being in awe of them, they can often end up being intimidated by them. So if you've got people with very high levels of interpersonal confidence, they will dominate discussions, often not be terribly good listeners, and other people will stop contributing. And of course, if teamwork is important, that's a big downside. So we don't ever present being mentally sensitive or mentally tough as good or bad. They just are. And they are aspects of ourselves. So we need to understand that better. Can we develop mental toughness? Well, the good thing about this is all the tools and techniques to develop mental toughness, if you need to, are well understood by coaches, by trainers, and they center around things like positive thinking tools and techniques, visualization, anxiety control. I'll skip the next one, goal setting, the test, and app development. So now app development, where we're beginning to develop apps that are basically games that you can repeatedly play, but will also measure a difference in some way. I've skipped one, that's attentional control. And that's, I think, in my view, probably the most valuable thing that somebody can do and nearly always works. And that's the ability to focus better, to concentrate better, and to concentrate and focus for longer. It's actually quite easy to develop, but it's the one thing that we probably were never taught at school or in college. It's really missing in a lot of development agendas. But if we can concentrate and focus on something, it's amazing how much more easily they can be achieved and how the stress of doing something is relieved. If you're really interested in having a go at an exercise, one thing that you might like to do is I've shown a little link, tiny.cc/RHR6BZ. If you make a note of that and do a search for it, do a Google search for it, you'll find a little exercise that's called the number grid, and it's a wonderful exercise for developing attentional control. This is an exercise that we've developed, and it's an example of what I mean at the bottom of the slide, app development. So that brings me to the end. I've now been talking, I was targeted to talk for about 40 minutes and use the balance of the time to deal with any questions that you may have. So thank you very much for listening so patiently to me. I'm happy to deal with any questions you want to throw my way. Okay, so one question is, how could somebody work on specifically their interpersonal confidence? So one very useful technique here is to use visualization. Visualization is a very powerful way of learning. People often think it's about daydreaming. Well, what we know about visualization as a technique is you can imagine a setting, you can put yourself in the setting, and you can do things to yourself in the setting, and you will learn as much as if you had actually done that in a real setting. So a very good, an example that might relate to would relate to interpersonal confidence is most people, when they're asked to do their first presentation, even if it's just a half a dozen people, break into a sweat and they worry about it. And then one of the reasons why they worry about it is they already begin to visualize it going wrong. You know, they think, oh my God, I'm not sure my notes are going to be right. What happens if I'm asked a really trick question? What happens if the equipment breaks down? What happens if? And they begin to worry about it. And then, sure enough, when any one of those events occurs, it's almost as if, well, I knew this was going to happen. I've screwed this up. However, if you use visualization in preparing yourself for a situation, what you can do is imagine that scenario. You can close your eyes and you can imagine doing that presentation, and you can imagine all of those things going wrong. But the advantage is in your head, you can stop and say, well, okay, I've dropped my notes. What's the worst that can happen? I need to pick them up. I can make an apology to the people listening and move on. Nobody's going to mind. Nobody ever minds you dropping a set of notes and picking them up. Nobody's going to think any of the worse of you. It's you that thinks the worst of yourself. But the thing you're doing is you are imagining, you're using visualization to be able to work out how to deal with any of those tricky situations that inhibit your interpersonal confidence. So using visualization is very effective. I have a dog that's probably waiting patiently outside of this room, and I like to take my dog for long walks into the remote countryside. So if I'm preparing for a meeting or for a presentation or somewhere where I need to engage with other people, I will often speak out loud as if they're there. So it's a form of visualization, I suppose. My dog's often bewildered by my behavior, wonders who the hell I'm talking to. But I also find that speaking out into the open and listening to my own voice helps me in many ways. It helps me to kind of think, oh, that didn't sound right. I could say that better. So for a lot of people, improving their interpersonal confidence is partly about making small developments, making small improvements in the way that they put things over to people, and then moving on from that. That's an interesting one. Do you think pilots are all part of a narrow personality spectrum? I would suspect that if we tested large numbers of pilots, we would find a general profile. But again, coming back to this notion that we're not labeling people, what we also know is that almost anybody can do anything. And so we will find mentally sensitive pilots, we'll find mentally tough pilots, and they can be equally successful provided they have that self-awareness. And so it goes back every time to self-awareness. Mental toughness is one aspect of you. There are other aspects like your skills, your knowledge, your interests, the support you have, the social support, the support you have in work. A lot of things contribute to your behavior. We know that mental toughness is probably the single most important element of that, but it's not the only element. So if you're incredibly talented, you're really interested in being a pilot, then you will do all the things that help you to make you a good pilot. You'll go and learn, you'll study, you'll practice, but then you need to overlay that with a positive attitude, with this mental toughness. If you are self-aware about your mental sensitivity, if you're doubting yourself in some way, even though you've done everything, but you understand that and you've developed coping mechanisms, you can be equally successful. So it's very often possible to identify typical profiles for specific groups of people, but we also find that people outside of those profiles can also do those jobs perfectly well. Interesting. What would be ways to snap somebody out of tunnel vision? Well, I guess that has to also come back to some sort of provoked self-awareness and reflection, because the thing that would snap me out of tunnel vision or doing something repeatedly would be sort of coming down to earth and understanding there's a consequence of that, and it's a consequence that I don't want. So I might be repeatedly failing at something because I'm stubborn and I won't change my mind. But after a time, for somebody that wants to succeed and wants to be more effective, that becomes an irritation, and you need to stop and think, well, what can I do differently? What can I do better? Okay, so I think I've dealt with the questions that have been asked. And we've got Joanna back. Oh, I can't hear you, Joanna. So are there any more questions? Is there anything else that somebody would like to cover? Ah, right. Okay, Fadi. You're thinking more like if your first officer suddenly was tunnel vision in an emergency. Right. It's a difficult one, because you really what can you do to snap them out of it? I think the only way, if it's an emergency, if you have a great belief in your ability to manage it, I think the way you would have to do it is to move the first officer out of the position that they're in and take over, and afterwards sit down with that first officer to discuss what's happened. I don't think you can go into a development exercise with somebody in an emergency situation. Okay, well, yeah. Must be frustrating for you, Joanna. Well, Fadi, it could well be that, one of the things that happens is when people go out of control, and we're really talking in terms of mental toughness about being able to maintain enough control of your life to be able to deal with most events, whether they are good events or bad events. Once you're in an event and it's going wrong, it's very hard to maintain perspective. You just end up sinking into it, and you very, very quickly begin to see things out of perspective. There's an interesting piece of research. I've forgotten the professor's name, but it's somebody that I work with quite a lot. And he has identified that there's an interesting concept that links to mental toughness, and that's something called directed forgetting. And by that, what it means, when things happen, and particularly unpleasant or negative or challenging or crises happen, some of us have got the ability to set what's happening to one side in our head and to maintain calm and poise. And when it says, he's describing this as deliberately forgetting what's going on. And what that does is allow you to maintain perspective. So, as you know, if you've ever been in even a sort of a temporary crisis, if it's a family crisis or something, if you don't get it in perspective, suddenly it overwhelms you. And once it overwhelms you, you're incapable of seeing things in its true perspective. And that inhibits your ability to see your way out of it. But some of us have got the ability to practice or adopt directed forgetting. And that means some of us have got the ability, when something's happening, is to be able to put the situation to one side and say, right, I know what's happening. I'm not going to worry about all the mess that's happening. I'm going to now focus on a solution. I'm going to focus on what I can do about it. I'm not going to allow the crisis or the problem to interfere with my ability to find a solution. I'll go back to looking at where the crisis came from and the crisis itself once it's all over with. So some of us have got that ability, others haven't. But it does mean that if you're in the middle of that crisis and you're working with somebody that isn't capable of doing that, there's not much you can do about them except remove them from that and then help them through reflection to understand why they responded that way and what they could do better in the future. Thank you, Fadi. Okay, so if there are no more questions, perhaps we can wind up. And from my perspective, thank you for listening patiently, and thank you for your questions. Some really good questions in there. I hope you found the session useful and interesting. I hope some of my passion comes over. It's a topic and a subject that I feel very strongly about, because we see in our work every day that applying this to people does make a big difference to their lives. So thank you for listening. If you want to, please connect with me on LinkedIn. We regularly post, and I'm talking about 2 or 3 times a week, updates that might be of interest to you. And by all means, follow me on Twitter and follow AQR on Facebook. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see we have a kind of a special offer. If you would like to complete the mental toughness questionnaire, there is an opportunity to complete it at a very much reduced price. So thank you again for listening, and perhaps we'll meet again sometime. For those of you who are now thinking about Christmas, enjoy your Christmas break, and we hope that all of us will have a better 2021 than 2020's been. 2020 is really the year that never was. So cheerio, everyone.